You knew it was coming, here it is. Hunter x Hunter is genius. Everyone knows it. There definitely isn't an extremely vocal set of people who absolutely see it as the most average thing ever. And if such people do exist, I'm certain they will switch off the video right here and they definitely won't leave a comment. But no, let's address the elephant in the room. Every series has a side of it that the cultural zeitgeist latches onto. People put down One Piece fans and say Luffy's the weakest of the old top 3, that Ichigo has the least development, and that Naruto is weak because he cries and has a bad haircut. 3 amazing series with 3 sets of warring fans. Just a subset of fans that aren't worth paying too much attention to. For Hunter x Hunter, a series which I find there to really be close to nothing to latch onto that ain't good. It's kind of just saying that it's mid, and that's it. I find that kind of funny, and a bit of a win for the series in and of itself. One of the main praises for a few years was that the series deconstructs the shonen genre. That one really riled up that other side of people who dislike the series. And many people nowadays think, no, it doesn't quite deconstruct anything so much as the series is just unique and tries to do new things where it can. The main character, Gon, before characters like Denji or Yuji came on the scene, was someone with a good heart who let these situations get the better of him and turn him onto the bad path. Whilst looking back, having that happen for a main character is not original. What Togashi does with it later is original. And 100 chapters later, our literal main character is excluded from the story to deal with the ramifications of that darkness. Another thing which people think is too confusing is the power system. But enough of the preamble, let's just jump right in. I will concede that the start of the series, whilst entertaining in its own right, is actually a bit slow and takes a little bit of time, and a lot of reading between the lines to get to the meaty and original stuff that early on. Like the backdrop for the Hunter exam is a cardboard cutout of a similar scene from YuYu Hakusho. It's only by reading through the lines or going through the series again that you see the importance of the power system being viewed from the POV of someone who can't see it. Hisoka, at first glance, has telekinesis, and that's a genius way to invoke fear in the protagonists. As we both now know, that isn't the case at all. And in many cases, Nen works this way. The characters in this story keep their cards close to their chest because they all have their weaknesses, big weaknesses. Hisoka makes the main characters stay on their toes, and that's all fun and games, but after this part of the story, when everyone has learnt the fundamentals of Nen, instead of letting things get stale, Togashi reverses the roles by making Hisoka the clueless one when Kurolo enters the story, with his ability to take powers. It's an evolution of that original scene. Here's Hisoka completely unknowing of what powers Kurolo holds in his book, and wanting to fight him because of it. And volumes later, by the time that the two actually do fight, Hisoka thinks he has a grasp on some of those powers, but Kurolo pulls out a bookmark, which means he can completely commit to one of the powers in his book, or even bookmark and utilize 2 of those powers at once. And it proves to be the death of him. And then Togashi furthers Nen even more by giving it a surge of power through death. Hisoka uses his gum to perform CPR on himself, and he literally revives back to life. It's a crazy system. And that small arc of Hisoka's, from beginning to now, displays how even if you understand the system, there are all sorts of crazy wrenches Togashi can throw to change everything all at once. The system is dynamic as hell. Fundamentally, aura is a life energy which can be channeled in 4 ways. Ten, which is like an equilibrium in which control of one's aura can be mastered. Zetsu is keeping it all bunched up and can be used for evasive maneuvers. Gon does this when he's hunting in the first arc. Ren is letting it stream out, typically when attacking for strength. And then Hatsu, which exerts aura from the user with purpose in mind, like Emperor Chain or Bungee Gum, which has the properties of both rubber and gum. After that Hunter exam arc, Togashi makes your classic tournament arc a really in-depth explanation of this power. And he information dumps brilliantly in between killing off interesting characters, rip in peace Castro, and drawing up some great fights. There's tons of little tricks and methods that users expend their energy on, and it's a goldmine for the type of combat scenes Togashi cooks up. Did I say cooks up again? It started with the team not even knowing what Nen is, and how they and us learn through Hisoka. But up until the Chimera Ant Arc, we kept on seeing again and again the large gaps between children and adults, telling us how far the characters have to come to grow to an advanced level. And then when they finally get a foothold on some kind of power, Togashi uses Nen as a piece of world building. He shows us how all these grown men and women with crazy powers are all nothing when compared to other potential species in the universe. Togashi has introduced curses and rituals, and now Nen Beasts. It'll be interesting to see how a Nen Beast works in an intentional fight, and Kurapika is squared up to fight one of the most awful looking ones. Oh, and by the way, if anyone says my pronunciations off, Togashi is going to delay the next release by a week. He just messaged me that, guys. Sorry. It's a genius power system, and one that seems to act like a muse for the story to grow. Togashi did a similar thing for Kurapika too, with the York New City arc covering his extensive training to create chains and the introduction of restrictions meant only to be used on the Phantom Troop for one of his powers. We saw how even the strongest physical combatant couldn't hope to break out of chain jail because of the power that restrictions hold. We got power stealing Nen introduced in this arc and Nen exorcists as well. Sometimes he even gets away from Nen for a bit like he did with Greed Island. A fan of Dragon Quest, he just kind of makes a game for the arc. Its premise is important for the plot, but you can tell he just puts forth some of his favourite things into the manga for the fun of it. And the fun of it seems to be a source of inspiration for him. Some very unreliable inspiration, but inspiration nonetheless. He even wrote once that he wanted to make a manga centered on a card game. But then, after Greed Island, the hiatuses started taking a turn for the worse. Togashi was bound by limitations in storytelling with YuYu Hakusho. Trying to make his own story, he was shot down in his tracks, the editors and publishers suppressing his creative freedoms as an author by outlining where he could take his own story. He was also at the whims of his overlords, so when his back exploded for the first time, enough was enough. He abruptly finished this story in an act of defiance, and he started Hunter x Hunter through his own limited company, Studio Pot. Because of this, Togashi has essentially created a legal representation of himself and his product, meaning that instead of Jump having ownership of the franchise, Pot has ownership of the franchise, and Pot sells out the means for Jump to release that product through their magazine. This means that in terms of the actual production, Jump is an entirely separate entity, and that Togashi has essentially made himself a contractor in an industry of employees. Either way, this freedom of any sort of deadline was no doubt for Togashi's chronic back pain, but also ended up as a catalyst for the depth of the story to increase, and they did so with the inception of the Chimera Ant Arc. Looking back at the beginning can be a strange thing, considering just how far the themes and the characters change. The Chimera Ant Arc tells a very original story, and a very divisive one at that, considering the vast majority of fans' favourite dynamic are Gon and Killua, a relationship that breaks down and then after many tears is in no way the same ever again. They bonded over very unique circumstances, Killua a trained assassin to an abusive family, and Gon an abandoned boy, whose sense of adventure is fueled ultimately by the lack of a strong male figure in his life. The search for his father is a motive he shares with Killua after the two get to know one another. The entirety of Greed Island and the deadly game of dodgeball is for this goal, and really, it's for his friend too. When Gon reveals that he knew how much the game would hurt Killua, it's played as a shock reveal. First, because Killua conceals his wounds, and then because Gon knew it would hurt. But he says that it had to be Killua because he wanted to share that goal with him. Sharing his burden shows how much his friendship means to Gon. Greed Island flows straight into this arc, as the two follow the path of Jing to find Kite. And Kite tells them, hey, I know what your dad is, but Gon prefers the adventure, prefers spending time with Killua, and so the two march on and help Kite, and their accomplishments start to muddy Gon's motives. Pito attacks, and Kite says retreat, but Gon stays. To protect them, Kite loses an arm, gets his head chopped off, and then gets his brain scooped out, and it is the complete undoing of Gon. But really, Gon was always going to behave like this. Kite is the father figure that he found years and years ago. He personally sacrificed his forearm in the fight just before this, and his neglect for the sake of friendship in regards to Killua just speaks more and more to his reckless abandon. When he wakes, he's all gung-ho to go and save Kite, but at this point the reality is already dawning on Killua. Sometimes you shine so brightly, I must look away. But even so, is it still okay if I stay by your side? He sees through the childish optimism. When Gon finds Pito and wants to kill her, it's the final nail in the coffin. She is vulnerable, but Killua says how she's needed alive if they want to have any hope. of restoring Kite, but Gon just wants revenge at this point, and he even pushes him away, since it means nothing to you. He's a very well-written, flawed character. I loved him when I first watched the show. Then reading the manga, and again, all I can feel is pity for Killua. The torture never ends. He just got away from his abusive family, learns to make a real friend, and now he gets this shit. And yet despite it all, he remains by Gon's side. It's so sad. Togashi develops Killua's character by deconstructing Gon's. There's that word again. What's really interesting is that this tracks a lot with his apology letter from when Yu Yu Hakusho got its rushed ending. He saw the future of the series as 2 ultimatums, one in which he repeats the same storylines over and over, or one in which he gets to deconstruct the characters. He literally says that. I'll link a few translations that all corroborate that usage of the word, but unfortunately Jump rejected that idea, which is why we got the ending that we did for Hakusho. And as per his plans, things get worse and worse for Gon. He doesn't care if everything ends, he makes a restriction and pledge of Nen, the rest of his potential concentrated into this moment to kill Pito. And the really nuts thing about the power of the enemies in this arc starts with this. All of his potential, all this insane power, only mirrors the king for a moment. Gon, years from now, at his peak, living out his prime, as powerful as he gets, take all of that and squish that down into one moment. That's how much it takes, and that's how powerful the enemy of this arc is, but we'll get to Meruem in a bit. The spiral of self-destruction ends with Killua taking Gon's ragged body and restoring him back to health through Nanoka. Thankfully, Killua started his own journey. He removes this needle from his brain put there by his brother, a needle which concealed Nanoka/Alaka's existence. Killua has his own person to find, and he does so whilst saving Gon. When the two say goodbye, they both pretty much realize that this is the end of the line. After having accomplished so much, they arrive at an impasse. The happiness and innocence gone. Ultimate friendship, a foil for some incredible tragic storytelling. Incredible strength used as a foil for one of the best fights, or anti-fights. Here's this incredible 100-plus-year-old man, the head of the hunters. Everyone respects him, everyone fears him, everyone loves him. He trained on a mountain for years to reach enlightenment. He has one of the strongest powers in the series. Netero's character design changes to adjust to the tone of the story. The setup for this match against the King of the Ants is a massive source of suspense. He loses and dies in the fight, but his death triggers a nuke, which just kills everything. Nothing can survive against it. Netero needed to be able to win at any cost, to the point that the lead human character just completely ignores Meruem's attempt at diplomacy. To talk more on him though, his first act is to kill one of his own, behead 2 parents in front of their kid, eat them, spit them out before using the kid as target practice, and then he eats her too. We start with this to normalize the violence of the arc, so that we can see when Komugi comes onto the scene just how much Meruem changes. He is the all-powerful, and no one is his match, but his Gunji game could use some improvement. Komugi plays Gunji to feed her family. She ends up being another foil. She is able to beat Meruem for a long enough time that he is forced to grow mentally, to learn from his mistakes. The care that he provides her is at first selfish, and then because of that time spent, becomes selfless. He was an absolute ruler, and that absolute loss really humbled him. He never wins, and even chooses to spend his final moments with Komugi, playing until he goes blind from radiation. He holds her hand, and we get the most human, helpless, regular death in the whole series. And it's sad because of how regular it is. We grow to sympathize for the king because of the journey he made towards an empathetic human mindset. Only because of the rose, by assuring death, was it possible for him to value life. And we are positioned with him right at the end, seeing his priorities, and we even lose sight ourselves as he goes blind, the blank pages and the black screen. Everything that everyone sacrificed for this arc, the tears, the end of friendships, their lives, it is brilliant character deconstruction. And it would have been mad if Yu Yu Hakusho went and did this, but I'm glad he finally got to write the kind of story that he wanted to. Togashi has described intense back pain, the likes of which completely debilitate him, but I think that's brought on by how hard he goes when he's making this story. When he works on the story, he works as though he doesn't have this disability until it comes back in full swing. He never seems to just, take it easy, half a page a day, half a page every other day, just be consistent but don't do much. It's only all or nothing. The hiatuses go up with the complexity of the story though, so there has to be an element of that which affects this too. One of the things that seems to spur him on is the anime adaptations. The biggest stream of releases we've had was during the release of the most recent anime, and that was the portion of the story that ended in a very fitting way. He drew and released all of those with varying levels of quality as the anime itself was on. Because of the ending, it's hard to imagine that he didn't do this because the anime would otherwise end in a really bad place. That is conjecture though, it could have just turned out magically perfect. When the series first got a pilot of sorts in July of 1998, Togashi was still writing the Hunter exam. And then later that year, when the series was given the go-ahead for a full-on anime, he was still on the Hunter exam, albeit he was at the end. But it's crazy to think how on his ass they were, especially considering the long breaks that would eventually come. And they would stay on his ass until March 2001, when Togashi would reach the end of the York New City arc. And looking closely at the dates, they were almost waiting weekly like us at that point. But then the anime would take a break to let Togashi progress. Mind you, they waited less than a year. It's just unimaginable to conceive how much Hunter x Hunter we were getting back then. They came back the following year. Togashi wrapped up Greed Island in June 2003, whilst the OVA had started just before that, in February 2003, when Togashi was halfway through. Though this time it was an OVA production, so they stopped and started when they needed to, and were never truly on his arse again. Togashi still ended this arc how he would with Chimera though, with a quickly, badly drawn finale. But yeah, kind of nuts that the world went from standard definition to the invention of high definition in the time it took for Chimera Ant Arc to finish. Though I suppose 4K has become mainstream in the time that this arc has gone on as well. Togashi got through the introductory part of it, and then the hiatuses came. Even when it wasn't that bad, he at least came out with something every single year, all the way up until 2014, with 2015 being the first year without any release at all. Throughout the years, Hunter x Hunter has had stage plays, movies, video games, and more. But 2015 was the first year of nothing. Absolutely nothing. And if anything, it confirms the series has staying power, that for the years after that, which also had nothing, we all were there to wait for more. The plethora of spin-offs really speak to the quality of Togashi's writing, namely because there is absolutely no comparison. But when you have never-ending hiatuses, you end up being drawn to it in an odd sort of way. During the release of the 2014 series, there were 2 movies released. The first film is called Hunter x Hunter Phantom Rouge, whilst the second film is called Hunter x Hunter The Last Mission. These films suck, but each has their own really promising aspects to them. The canon part of Phantom Rouge adapts a little mini manga that Togashi made, and is really fun to watch. It's like a deleted scene or something, and the premise for The Last Mission was Battle Olympia, which is like the fighting Olympics in this universe. An amazing idea, considering Togashi has pretty much dropped that now. There were also stage plays, and at least they had the modesty to treat everything as a big joke, taking the voice actors and just putting them in all these ridiculous outfits straight out of 80s Doctor Who.
You meddling fool!
When things get derivative, they tend to get bad. There's no twist quite as good as Togashi's, no fight as exciting or dynamic, no original character has been as fun as any of even the hundreds of throwaways that he's created. The only alternative is putting Hunter x Hunter into something like a fighting game. Nen Impact releases sometime this year and seems about as middling as anything. The series started with Game Boy games, and that sounds like a good fit for the series, and then there was a Dragon Quest-like for the PS1, an Overhead Fighter for the PS2, an RPG for the PS1 again, and then a Game Boy Advance game in 2003. And then there wasn't anything until Wonder Adventure for the PSP. The prevalence for handheld games is great, but my god, 2003 to 2013 had nothing. They just narrowly missed the best handheld console of them all. The DS had some of the best games ever released, games that truly stretched what you could do with a portable console to the absolute extreme. And then Wonder Adventure in 2013. It just makes me think they could have made a 3DS game too. A lot of the games have original stories, but were never released internationally, so I can't really comment on their quality. But for the ones that I can comment on, there isn't a great deal of promise. Maybe the only exception to that is Sui Yoshida. He once wrote a one-shot that explores Hisoka's origins in a circus. First of all, his art style and Togashi's blend together really convincingly well. There was even a point in time where people thought that Togashi and Ishida were the same person, that the hiatuses were caused in part due to Togashi writing Tokyo Ghoul, and that the breaks in between Tokyo Ghoul were for more Hunter x Hunter. This isn't the case, but just a weird little history in the community if you've been here for the ride long enough. People are doing the same thing now with Gege Akutami, the guy who makes Jujutsu Kaisen. The one-shot has a pretty big focus on combat, and the way that Ishida writes Nen-based combat is fun. A large part of the difficulty that would come with replicating Togashi would be the difficulty with making the fights fun and realistic to the world. And it's something he did well, though this was an origin story, so the power levels weren't crazy high or anything. But basically, whole spiel aside, Hunter x Hunter is genius because it has Togashi's fingerprints all over it. I love how much these arcs, and especially those first chapters, embrace the journey as though it was a Dragon Quest game. A small village, catching a beast to prove yourself, and then taking a boat to the most surreal and aberrant kind of exam that Togashi could think up. There is a magic to the feeling of the story as the group gets to know each other and become friends, even when Hisoka chooses to keep an eye on them. On a first watch or a first read, it somehow feels nostalgic. I don't know how else to phrase it. It's like the way in which the story unfolds is both childish enough to open up our imagination and set aside our disbelief, and then it's filled with all these hooks, both plot-wise and character-wise, that just really endear you to the world. I get a similar vibe with One Piece, even though the two are apples and oranges. They hook you in the same way if you take the first saga and the Hunter exam arc and hold them side by side. There's also the fact that we don't even need rose-tinted glasses to make us feel nostalgic. When Togashi started the series, the in-universe year was 1999. In Greed Island, we start to see the beginning of the year 2000. In the most current part of the story, it's 2001. 2001, guys. So yeah, no need to feel nostalgic. PS1s are all the rage. It's funny seeing Togashi try and keep up with time, as all of a sudden flip phones are being replaced with iPhone 4s. And yes, when the current arc started, the iPhone 4 was new. But we are in the second half of 2001, so soon it will be 2002. Good year, that one. I think I was 5, mind you. Togashi was of that generation that venerated Akira Toriyama and his series Dragon Ball. As a result of both this and the fact that this series has been going since the 90s, the series' main art style still retains that lovely 90s kind of look, the kind that Sailor Moon, Trigun, Inuyasha, and other contemporary mangas had at the time. I loved that Heaven's Arena, this really old story arc from the 90s, amazing as it is part of the manga that we're all still reading. There's a real charm to the early chapters and the vibes that they give. I detail how his progress has come along in the Artistic Evolution video, but to just focus on the early manga, it was really something special. That big block of progress he made from the simple times of the Hunter exam to the thrilling action of Greed Island was an amazing body of work in its own right, and almost stands as a great shonen by itself. But having talked plenty on the journey, it's time to talk about that which Jing and Togashi would rather we not value too much. The story isn't finished. For a good few years, we were given this letter in Shonen Jump and didn't even know what magazine this series was going to turn up in. After the Chimera arc, we got the reuniting scene with Jing and Gon. Everything's wrapped up in a bow. I won't say a neat little bow. Togashi's gone on record with saying that the story honestly could have ended there, and wrote it in a way that one could stop there. And it's a brilliant ending. A bit sad, mind you, with the whole Killua thing in mind, but as explained before, he just wanted to go further with it. So here we go with the Dark Continent arc. Gon is doing schoolwork whilst Kurapika and Leorio go outside the human world and into the realm which Meruem's mother came from. The source of a lot of the strange, Lovecraftian, SCP type stuff in this world, we've kind of steadily gone from an action-adventure world into much more of a science fiction fantasy, in terms of how gargantuan the rest of the planet is. The Dark Continent arc is 10 chapters long, and reads more like an outline of everything that Togashi wanted to touch base on for the next 30 years. We have Beyond Netero, who wants to commercialize the Dark Continent for regular people, but the regular people aren't actually going, they're being dropped off on a different island before the real expedition begins. All of the Zodiacs are there, all of the Phantom Troop are there, Hisoka's there, 3 separate mafia families are there, and an entire elaborate royal family is coming along for the ride too. When this little arc ended, we then jump to the boat and start an entire succession war in which all of the royal family compete to become the next king of Kakin. And because of allegiances, everything that happens to them directly or indirectly affects the mafia families. And now the Phantom Troupe are also shaking the bag by getting involved with the Mafia as well. They are literally bringing their vendetta against Hisoka into the mix, and as it stands, we've had 60 chapters of Game of Thrones level build-up. And speaking of Game of Thrones, I feel like the elephant in the room simply has to be addressed, seeing as he's already given us a stopping point. Sometimes the big sprawling masterpiece doesn't get to finish. There are all sorts of problems that come when a genius goes about making an entire universe by themselves. Unfortunately, it seems like these problems only pop up when the true scope of the project is apparent. We've got to look no further than someone like George R.R. Martin and the winds of the book that will never come out. He released 5 amazing fantasy novels, and then, when his work got adapted into Game of Thrones, he struggled and struggled to finish the 6th. And he's still writing it now, 13 years later. There's a whole world of difference between manga and books, but backaches aside, we shouldn't look too far from the fact that both these guys have put way more on their plate than they can chew. Martin's problem seemed to be a complete loss of control. He had this outline that headed 3 sections of the story, and with all 5 books of a planned 7 in consideration, we have barely even begun the 2nd act, with 2 books left. Further to that, the events of the 1st act took the first 3 books to write up. And the 4th book got so big that the 5th book is actually the 2nd half of that book. It's impossible to guess what the true problem is, but the one feasible solution of just letting go of some control and co-writing and getting help is a big similarity to our situation. Togashi says that if he were to pass the drawing of characters to someone else, his career as a mangaka would be over, as he wouldn't be able to see himself as a mangaka. Martin clearly has similar reservations and pride when it comes to getting help. George says he's a gardener, which basically means he knows how he wants the story to end, but will get himself there without knowing how. But will get to it without knowing... But will go towards it without knowing how to get there exactly. And I can't help but feel that Togashi is of a similar breed in that regard. He just creates more and more characters and locations, plots within plots within plots, and hopes that it'll get him to where he needs to get. Plots within plots you might have recognized as a recurring phrase from Dune, a series by Frank Herbert. Once again, novels, not manga, but by a man who did not live to see his series fully told, or at least told in the way that he intended. He wrote one of the best sci-fi books ever made, followed it up with an incredible, almost deconstruction of what the main character was, and then ended a trilogy like a Fallout game.
War never changes.
And then Herbert had another 4 books planned, 7 books total. God Emperor, this insane philosophical character study. Heretics, an action set piece which acts as the first part of a spiritual successor to the original book in many ways. And then Chapter House. Herbert's wife died during the writing of this book, and the end seems to very much reflect his mind during that time. He wraps up an entire war in 50 pages, and ends this whole saga with a melancholy pondering of 2 insert characters, clearly meant as him and his wife. Whatever writing process he had and story he had in mind for Dune 7, it seemed to die with her. An unfinished masterpiece. Oh, but wait, Dune goes on, Dune 7 and Dune 8. Frank's son carried on the intellectual property and expanded the universe, and he does it with this other writer called Kevin J. Anderson. And oh god, it is so bad. It makes you wonder if Frank would ever have written stuff like this, or if this rushed ending was rushed because this was how he would have preferred for things to end. In a rare defiance of what literally is canon, none of the fandom consider anything not written by Frank as canon. To get to the world of manga, Vagabond is a series which depicts the life of Miyamoto Musashi, and it has a deep spiritual vibe. The artwork is sometimes jaw-droppingly gorgeous and photorealistic just through skill alone. The absolute life that's captured on these pages for as long as it was is something that never fails to take your breath away when you read, no matter when you do. Takehiko Inoue is clearly a master of the art of manga. His storytelling, sometimes through writing, sometimes through art, sometimes through a mix of both, is nothing less than an experience that has to be read to be believed. The kind of series you'll catch up on and search on Reddit for something comparably good, and one which you'll never find an adequate answer for. The series stopped releasing almost 10 years ago, with the artwork seeing a lot less of that passion, And the story, ironically, ending right as Musashi learnt the way of peace and life against following violence and death. Since then, Inoue went on to be a basketball coach. Berserk ended up unfinished because its mangaka Kentaro Miura passed away. It's just as big and rich a universe because of his immense skill with writing and art. He took a long time to release, maybe because of that art, but there is a silver lining. Miura told the ending to his best friend Koji Mori, and now, years after his death, the manga goes on, his assistants doing the art, and Mori doing the story. There are cracks, and nobody expected it to be perfect, but the decision to attempt a continuation without any changes in title or construction is a bold move, no matter what side you stand on. Consensus has swung around a little as to how much Mori knew about the road to that ending, with the belief that he only knew a few bullet points up to the ending, seeming to be the main belief these days. These big, sprawling series have inherent things that draw us in, but they have inherent flaws. And the reason I'm bringing up Inoue, Martin, Miura, Herbert is to show all the different things that can happen to a series like this, and how they're all doomed to fail in a way. Doomed to tell the best stories we've ever heard, at the cost of the ending itself. The only man seemingly defying everything is Oda, but that's the thing, he ain't done yet. Every time Togashi's gone away for over a year, it's a genuine miracle that he could even be asked to pick up that story he left off with, that also has 200 characters running around. I find writer's block and hiatuses really interesting. There's all sorts of reasons for the unfinished masterpiece, but it does all seem to speak to the archetype of the struggling artist. It sucks that these stories and worlds, so hard to craft for such obvious reasons, become such cumbersome, life-consuming tasks. Because for all of their effort, they create the best reads that I've ever read. And if I read fiction, it's now something I absolutely need to be able to feel. A world that feels lived in, and characters' lives that feel well lived. For years, we'd had nothing but frustration, but a few years back, he started a Twitter account, giving us updates on the production of the manga. Though, unfortunately, this seemed to fade away as another hiatus came. It was an important stepping stone in what used to be a very frustrating process as a fan. We got a lot of insight into what it takes to make the manga, from the storyboards being the easiest, to the inking being a slow and lengthy day-to-day process, and then the colouring of all things somehow being the most energy-consuming step of the bunch. Before the recent hiatus, he inked all the way to chapter 404. In this most recent phase, he's managed to get from 404 to 420. That's 16 chapters at once, which doesn't beat his longest streak, but it's close. He even handed the colouring over to one of his assistants in the end. He thanked the fans for that decision, and it can only be a good thing that Twitter, or X, was able to let that happen. He has commented on the past that he intends to finish it, but also joked that he may die of old age before he ever gets to that point. As the years go by, that joke gets less and less funny. But more recently, something attitude-wise may have changed within him. Late last year, Togashi actually revealed for the first time further details on the ending, that there were 4 possible routes that he'd like to take the story, lettering them as endings A, B, C, and D. On this talk show, he revealed ending D, and that it should be considered the ending if he dies. It takes place years in the future, with Gon's granddaughter. He gave a strange statistic on audience reactions to his proposed ending, which means a chunk of people just casually know the endings, which is strange to think about, but anyway. Ending A received 80% positive reception, B a 50% positive reception, and C a 90% negative one. But Togashi's personal preference for those endings was C. I've sourced that below, that was Anime News Network, but there is a further translation, like this one by Jap in a Box on the Hunter subreddit, which I'll also link. In this, he says that the goal is to come up with an ending that is better than all of these 4 endings, so that he doesn't have to end up using any of them. Ending D is one that has been completely disregarded, but in the event of his death, it's all we got, and that's the one that he revealed on this show. So, with that in mind, knowing that this is not intended to be canon, if this is it, I'm just gonna go through it now and close us out with this. A girl is holding a fishing rod by a pond, not moving a muscle. The rod suddenly bends, and the girl shouts. Her name is Gin. It's here. Carrying the Lord of the Lake over her shoulder, she stands in front of a woman proudly and says, "Mum, I caught the Lord as promised." Gin gets even closer to the woman and continues with a quiet voice. So now you'll never tell me to become a hunter ever again, right? The woman reluctantly nods. Gin leaves with the Lord on her shoulders. The mother says, I thought that fishing the Lord would awaken the hunter in her. The woman wanting her husband next to her to agree with her. He says, never leaving the island and taking over the store. That's Gin's current wish. Let's respect that. The woman still looks dissatisfied. Well, she might change her mind along the way. Why are you so... I guess that's Great-Grandma Mito and Grandma Noko's blood. The husband smiles quietly. Unable to give up, the woman continues. But Grandpa Gon was a famous hunter. I'm sure she'll leave the island someday. Gin says, I'm not leaving. The daughter yells from the depths of the forest, where she can no longer even be seen, where she can't possibly hear her parents exchange. The father mutters happily. She sees right through us. The scene changes to a store that has been around since Mito's time. The Lord of the Lake has been filleted cleanly, and all parts have been prepped. Gin thinks Mum doesn't understand that when Gramps talks about memories of his hunter days fondly, Grandma Noko modestly bleeds her feelings of loneliness of not having been able to have been next to Gramps. She slams the cutting board hard with the hand holding the knife. I refuse, she thinks, to wait for someone's return for months and years, or to make someone wait for me. Then a door opens. A calm, peaceful voice resonates. A pudgy kid comes in, holding plants. He says, got some wild plants. Oh dang, you really caught the Lord. Let's treat everyone on the island. I can just imagine everyone's happy faces. Come on, let's get started. The two cook with huge smiles on their faces. A bird flies away from the island. The bird soars through the sky. Underneath the bird is a town, some place. People from all walks of life. Someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's grandchild are living in various places, smiling. It might be the child of that character, or the grandchild of that character. The bird flies away into the sky, and we see at the end, someone from behind.